Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the July edition of the Divorce Support Club with me, Claire Macklin. And today I'm joined by Natasha Alsop from Walker Family Law and Dan Gornall from Centurion Financial Planners. Very brief introductions, first of all. Dan, as you're our special guest, would you like to introduce yourself first?
Sure, thank you for having me. So I'm Daniel
Pleasure.
Gornall. I'm a chartered financial planner at Centurion, where focus mainly on giving financial advice to those going through separation and divorce. And I'm proud to be only one of 35 resolution accredited financial experts in that field. So I do a lot of work with clients, either as a shadow expert for one or as a financial neutral for both, but helping them with all those difficult decisions when it comes to splitting finances fairly and amicably prior to separation, but then also being able to give financial advice at the point of separation as well.
Thank you, Dan. And Natasha.
Yes, thank you, Claire, and lovely to have you with us today, Daniel. Thank you. Yes, I'm a solicitor here in our family department in Devon mainly, but I do cover some of Somerset. I've been a solicitor for over 23 years and practicing for about 25 years, paralegal prior to training. And yeah, we've got a team of us here, lead our team here of various solicitors, paralegals, trainees dealing with divorce, children matters, or the whole arena really of family law work.
Thank you very much. And I'm Claire Macklin. I'm a breakup and divorce coach. So I work with people through the emotional turmoil of separation and divorce and help them to move forward into new lives afterwards. So together we form a real supportive team on the financial, the legal, and the emotional sides. So today we're going to talk through five of the biggest financial pitfalls that Dan sees people fall into through the divorce process. And throughout that, we're going to have a conversation around those topics, and Dan is going to give us some really brilliant practical suggestions for what you can do to make sure, or to try and make sure you don't fall into those pitfalls. So, Dan, what's the first mistake that you would like to bring our awareness to?
Sure. So mistake number one, I'd say, is people focusing on the house but ignoring pensions. So most people know exactly what their house might be worth, but generally have no idea what their pensions are worth. And actually, and maybe surprisingly to some, pensions can be the second largest asset after the family home, and in some cases even worth more. However, research has shown that pensions are often overlooked during divorce, and in the Fair Shares report published a couple of years ago, it actually confirms that in only 11% of divorces, a pension sharing arrangement was made. Now, that's not to say that there was not offsetting instead of the pension, but it does show that there's probably an indication that pensions were not fully considered appropriately in a lot of divorces. So it is important that that is taken into account. There's often a common misconception that my pension is mine, your pension is yours, and that's that. But actually, the courts will confirm, and I'm sure Natasha will be able to confirm the legal stance, but it's often considered a matrimonial asset that needs to be considered as part of the other matrimonial assets. When people look at their pensions, they might look at the cash equivalent value. So you can get a value for your pension, but often that doesn't always tell the whole story of what that pension is actually worth, particularly if you have any defined benefit or public sector pensions, such as through the NHS, civil service teachers, for example. And just as a working example, a NHS pension worth, say, £300,000 can be quite a different outcome in terms of income compared to a £300,000 pot in a defined contribution scheme. Mm-hmm. And then probably the last point I'd make on this is that people understandably think more about the short-term consequences of their separation and how assets are divided, but should probably take and pay more attention to their future retirement plans and the impact of the settlements on those. And then just as a very quick example, just to show kind of how people do fail to consider these fully, they might quabble over access to a £5,000 shared bank account, whilst at the same time ignoring potentially hundreds of thousands of pounds worth of pension disparity. So that's why it's important to have the right team around you to make sure that pensions are addressed appropriately.
Yeah, so it's so important, isn't it, to get that long-term advice, just, not just thinking about the very short term. I'll talk about that a little bit more in a moment. Natasha, where does the sort of the legal and the financial sort of cross over here?
Yeah, well, I think Dan makes the good good point about considering pensions as early as possible is really important. So when you go through the process, you'll have to go through financial disclosure. So you give each spouse gives to the other their financial information. Sometimes that's obvious because they share bank accounts and everything's shared and pensions are visible. Sometimes it's not. And as Dan says, sometimes people won't even think about the pension assets or consider what it is. It'll just be like, well, I know that I use husband and wife, husband's got a pension. I don't necessarily need to think about that because I'm focusing on today rather than tomorrow, really. I'm thinking about what I need now. When you go through that financial disclosure, one of the most practical, important things you can do is apply to your pension provider for the value of that pension for divorce purposes as soon as possible. It's one of the first things you need to do in terms of kind of the practical financial information that phase, because it can take up to 3 months. Pension providers have up to 3 months to provide that information. With public sector pensions, they can take longer because of various issues that they have going on from time to time in the public sector. So one of the first things you should do is apply for that. That should be free. You shouldn't get charged for it as long as you haven't had one in the last 12 months or the pension's not in payment. That should come free of charge, and both spouses need to do that as soon as possible. I appreciate it's not always that easy when you don't know, and you might be the spouse who doesn't have any pension provision, but that's one of the practical things you can do early on.
If I might just add to that, Natasha, you make a really good point. They're often free. You get one free per year for pensions not yet in payment, but when they become in payment, scheme administrators will often charge for those calculations.
Yeah, they
maybe
do. Yeah,
maybe in
right.
those circumstances, it might be best to check with your legal professional what's the best timing to get that, just so it's not out of date by the time we actually need to refer to it.
Yeah, exactly. But yeah, because they do take quite a while to come in. I often find the case that we'll then go through voluntary disclosure, Dan, and I'm sure you've seen this, and then we're just all sat there waiting for someone's pension to come in. So it's worth getting them in early, really, is what we say, because unless you know that you've got court proceedings and you need them just before court, but if you've got them in early, sometimes, not all the time, but then experts, whether that be financial planners or advisors, depending on the type of pension, or a specific actuary who's instructed, can update that if we're in a limbo situation where they don't want to then pay out, or they don't, we're 6 months in and they say, well, actually only 6 months have changed. It depends. Experts will let you know whether they can do that whilst you're waiting for updated valuation. So that's another option. And I'm sure you've come across that, haven't you, Dan, where you can look at some actuaries or financial planners can say, well, look, it was 6 months ago, I can give you an indication, or we can wait and either a year or pay for an updated valuation. Is that fair?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So when would you advise that people need to get very specialist pension advice?
Yeah, so public sector particularly. So the public sector pensions, generally speaking, I mean, assuming other than pensions that are very small or they haven't been running for very long, generally speaking, you will often need an actuary to work out pension division on public sector pensions, some larger pension pots. So there is some guidance. It's called PAG, Pensions Advice Guidance Reports. There's reports that there was one report done some years ago, and that's recently been updated, and it's a really detailed document, but it does give both myself, other solicitors, Dan, financial planners, all guidance, and I'm sure Dan will be very familiar with PAG as to
copy by my bedside table.
Yeah, when you might need, it's a very detailed document, but when you might need that, when you might need to go to an actuary, when you might need financial planner, when you might need to just say, okay, that's a very small pot, we can do this. We know that there might be £20,000 in a pot, which is an old school, what they call money purchase. I'm sure Dan will be able to give you the actual terms. And then you might say, well, look, we can deal with that very differently from even £70,000 in the public sector, and definitely anything kind of over £100,000. But it does depend on the particular case. There's no kind of general, it's not across the board. If it's this, it's this. If it's that, it's that. It doesn't work like that. It really does depend on the other aspects, what other pensions there are. Do both parties have public sector? It really needs to be looked at as a broad brush approach, and the court will want some evidence, and in other times the court will say they don't want evidence. So our job is to guide you as to what we think the court will want if you are in dispute, or if not, what we think you need in order to look at settlement. And so that's what we'll be looking at. And the earlier you can get advice, particularly in relation to pensions, the better. And sometimes that will be you have been presented already with a valuation. For example, you may have a husband in public sector, a wife in, small pension pot and a defined contribution. And husband said, here's my valuation. It's all very clear. And it may be that you want to go and get your own advice, and that's called shadow advice. I think, Dan, you might have mentioned yourself as you give
That's
a shadow advice. So that might be, actually, I don't want to kind of go into the, detailed kind of joint expert and all sorts of kind of lengthy processes at the moment. I just want to go off and get some peace of mind for myself. And that will be then going off to a financial advisor, financial planner, someone like Dan, who's resolution accredited, or an actuary you might want to go to and say, I'd like you just to look at this in the first instance and guide me as to what I may want. And that's beyond what solicitors even do. They might say, look, you need to go off now to a financial planner, and they may well say, look, we actually need to go off to an actuary now and get some further input here. But when you get the basic information in first, that's the platform then for you to decide what expert
evidence springboard, isn't it?
Yeah, so that's that starting point. And I'd be very surprised if most solicitors will say we need that as our starting point, and we can then guide you as to what experts will assist you. And sometimes they may come to Dan first and say, look, I've got this information, can you help me? And Dan may then say, well, this is what you're going to need. I think that's fair, isn't it, Dan?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, one of my future mistakes I'll raise will go into that in a bit more detail.
Yeah, but I think another thing to bear in mind just on the PAG report thing is just there is this misconception, Dan, you will undoubtedly have heard this, where people say, well, it's only pensions during the marriage that can be shared. Even though, one party may say, well, it's my pension, it's not shareable. And we would say, well, it is a matrimonial asset. There is then guidance. You shouldn't exclude all the other pensions. Everything has to come into the pot. This isn't sometimes pensions pre-marriage, post-separation do come into the mix, and it depends on lots of different things. The other assets, needs, all sorts of things. It's not just those pensions. So don't assume, and I have this so often, I've got the pension during the marriage, but we're not going to bother about the armed forces pension for 20 years because it doesn't apply to us. It does. You have to get all those pensions in. So that's just something to bear in mind. It's not only pensions during the time you were married that need to be considered, even if they aren't necessarily shared at the outcome. It depends on circumstances as to whether they also get shared.
Yes, so they all need to be disclosed, and then that's what you've got everything on the table, haven't you, effectively, and then you have the conversations about what you're going to do with it all. I wanted to just go back a little bit to some of the emotional stuff here as well, because what I see a lot is, and I'm sure you two do as well, is that clients have very emotionally strong ties to family home. And often what we see is one person will say, well, I will keep the family home, and the other person not going to take any claim on their pensions. And I think, there are so many reasons why that happens. Your family home is your place of stability. It's perhaps tied up with your identity. It's where your children may have grown up. It's where you have maybe 20, 30 years worth of memories. It holds massive significance. And on top of that, our brains love what's familiar. And at a time when everything around you may feel like it's really changing, your brain will hold on to those things that feel really familiar and safe. And for many people, one of those things is living in the family home. And the pension, on the other hand, can feel like it's very far away, somewhere in the distance. Certainly when I was getting divorced the first time in my mid-30s, that's how I felt. I was much more concerned with staying in the home and the pension, that's 30 years' time. I don't need to worry about that now. And that's present bias. We are so much more worried about the immediate danger or the immediate threat than a threat that might appear in 20 or 30 years' time. What I say to all my clients is go and talk to somebody like Dan, go and get some cash flow forecasts, go and see what that future will look like, so that you are at least making a really informed decision when you think about your emotional attachment to the family home. And of course, on the other side, there is also an emotional attachment to the pension for some people. It's my pension. I've worked really hard for that, these things are really difficult and really tricky to come to terms with, and that's where working with somebody like me or with a therapist may help to get your head around, I suppose, some of the things that you may need to consider when you're going through financial disclosure and financial discussions.
Yeah.
Dan, moving on to mistake two. Tell us about the second thing that you often see clients doing that can be a mistake or a pitfall that they fall into.
Sure. So this actually naturally leads on from a point you just mentioned there,
Mm,
which can use cash flow to help you you work out
yeah.
the potential better outcome for yourself as a client. So mistake number two is accepting a settlement because it feels fair rather than because it works. So what I mean by that is some settlements can look fair on paper, or if you're looking at the assets on a spreadsheet, for example, you agree to split your assets 50-50. Maybe the house is worth a similar amount to the pension, so one keeps the house, another keeps the pension. So pensions, yes, are being considered, but by keeping a house, there's naturally some potential pitfalls there itself. So
Mm,
the better questions in that situation would be, if you're keeping the house, can you actually afford to keep the house?
mm,
What happens if any maintenance were to end? Will your savings last? So given that you're giving up your right to a pension entitlements, where is that replacement income coming from? And
mm,
what would happen when you retire? Where would you get your, how would you meet your expenses at that point? And like we've said already, instead of just focusing on the short term, what will that settlement look like to you in 10, 20 years time? So that's where cash flow modeling is essential for clients in that position, just to just help better understand whether that proposed settlement will be sustainable over the long term. And that's where a lot of my work is focused for those clients pre-settlement, just helping them, work out the long-term impacts. And cash flow is brilliant as well because it's a visual indicator of your financial future rather than, I suppose, we will get number fatigue when you're looking at spreadsheets and reports. So it's actually quite nice to see it in colorful charts.
Yes, and
Um,
those charts, I think, enable people then to start thinking about um, if that's what my future looks like financially, and I can see it in this lovely coloured chart. What does that actually mean? Will I be able to go on holiday? Will I be able to buy a new car? Will I be able to, whatever it might be, continue to pay the mortgage on the house? Will I be all of those questions, which is what you're talking about, really, isn't it? So it's, the difference between dividing things equally and perhaps there being equity in terms of outcome, perhaps is what we're talking about, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. It's just thinking rather than just focusing on is the settlement fair, but also
Mm,
considering does it work for me? Will I be okay?
mm.
And that's where cash flow can help quantify that.
Yeah, and I think we were talking about this earlier, and it could be using the word fair can be there are different perspectives on what fair might mean. And then Natasha, the court looks at
Yeah,
fair too, doesn't it? But in a slightly different way.
it does, and I think that's right. The interpretation of fair in different minds, it's subjective, isn't it? So what one
Mm,
person considers fair, but there's a legal term of fairness that runs through the decision-making process for the judges. It's in case law. It's, the fairness dictates X or fairness dictates Y. And so the legal term that a judge may use when they talk about is this fair overall will be looking at the fairness of that settlement in terms of parties meeting needs and what we call the kind of section 25 factors you've heard us talk about in different podcasts, which is this shopping list that a judge must look at to decide, is this overall, does fairness, does this apply to both parties here? Is it a fair settlement for both? Which is different, as Dan says, from a client's perspective of what they might consider fair in their
mm,
situation. And I think, I also think clients sometimes come in and say, well, I know that my wife had inheritance that ended up paying off the mortgage in the marriage. And so it's only fair that she should probably take all that back. And then the court might look at it differently. The court might say, well, actually, fairness is you both having a home now. We're not as concerned about what money went into that home. It is a factor, but, not as concerned, because fairness for a judge is actually how that then looks for housing needs in the future.
mm.
But yeah, as Dan says, cash flow and the cash forecast, in the future is something that we don't go into. We provide the legal advice and we say, well, actually, on paper, as Dan said, this looks like a fair division and something that a judge will approve. And in very broad terms, you give the risks to the client. What should they be considering? Change of mortgage interest rates. They might be having support from benefits agencies, so that might end, or maintenance of a property that they might have to pay out, and it may well be that their spouse has decided not to buy yet, to rent, and then use their withdraw from their pension later on to buy. Well, what's the interim position? And that's that forecasting and planning that Dan talks about. I expect, if you've got some money and you're investing that money, but you're not actually then maintaining a home or paying those extra interest payments on a mortgage, which is going to be fair for you overall as the best outcome financially. And that might be slightly different to how it looks from a legal perspective. So getting both of those advice early on and time and together.
Yes.
And yeah, I think there is also, from your point of view, Claire, you would have seen this with clients about the heavy weight from where that money's come from, or if we see this a lot, someone might come in and they say, well, actually, I feel awful about this because, the marriage is broken down. I formed a relationship with someone else. It's my fault this is happening. And therefore, I think it's only fair for me to give up X. And again, that might not look, they might regret that in a year or so, and it might, from a financial point of view, be quite difficult for them to manage financially.
Yes.
And
so
so
that's
if you see,
where,
do you have that kind of thing where your clients are saying, look, do I just walk away financially because I feel guilty, if you like? So,
yes. Yeah. So those really strong emotions, it might be guilt, or it might be, you might be, I might be talking to the other person in that relationship who's saying, well, my partner had an affair and has moved in with this other person, and I'm really angry about that. And so all these strong emotions come up around this too. And those don't feed into how the court looks at it at all. And I think people often find that really hard. If someone has behaved badly, if we look at it, from their perspective, then but the court doesn't take that into account. So it's a very different that, there is fair and fair and fair, and they're all very different. And so that's why I think it's helpful for people to speak to all of us around their feelings around that, around what would be a fair outcome for them, and all sorts of things. It's much more complex than just saying, right, well, we divide it down the middle.
yeah, it is
Much more complex. Yeah.
in all aspects.
In
And
all
it's just
aspects.
important, as we've talked about in other discussions, about being prepared, isn't it? Having all the information at the outset so you can make the decision that you think is a decision that's going to work for you in the long term, both the short term and the long term. And it's just about getting that information in and making sure you're prepped, if you like.
Absolutely. And also making sure that when there is let's say there's a proposal on the table, proposed settlement on the table, the importance of understanding consequences of that proposed settlement before you agree to it. And I think, something that I see a lot is I work with clients who feel that they're being pressured into agreeing to perhaps that first proposal. A spouse might say, well, here's the proposal. I've always been fair. I've always looked after our money. I've looked at everything, and this is how it's going to be. This is how I can see it being fair. And I always counsel people not to just accept the first proposal and to feel pressured to do that. It's really important for people to then go and speak to you, Natasha, and particularly to you, Dan, to actually look at what that proposal means for them going forward. And many people are afraid to ask questions at that point, especially if the dynamic in the marriage has been such that one of you, for whatever reason, has always taken control of your finances. It can be quite daunting and quite scary to ask those questions. But Dan, I think you can help people identify what those important questions might be.
Yeah, absolutely. And I probably must say as well, 9 times out of 10, when that situation arises, the pressured first proposal, it's often not a fair or equitable outcome for the person receiving that proposal. Just it may be the other party taking advantage of maybe the imbalance of their financial knowledge, in the relationship. So very important to get the right team around you for legal, financial,
or of course,
emotional support.
Or of course, making assumptions like any premarital pensions don't come into the pot. There could be all sorts of assumptions that person has made which underpin that proposal, which actually, if you went to take some advice, you would be able to pick those apart.
And often you find that the party proposing these, maybe based on out of date legislation, or maybe they sought their own independent advice from a man in the pub, so clearly not to be relied on. So again, it's always worth having a a professional pair of eyes looking over these things before you agree to anything.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, let's move on to mistake number 3 then, Dan. What's the third thing that you see people doing?
So I often find for mistake number 3 that people underestimate tax and implementation when it comes to the settlements. So I'll just give you a few examples. So people would see £100,000 in 2 different types of investment, for example, maybe £100,000 in a pension and £100,000 in an ISA, and think, oh, that's worth the same. It cancels each other out. But it's worth considering that generally pension income is taxable, but ISA withdrawals wouldn't be. So that's why it's always important to, when looking at your assets, look at the net value of assets. If you're looking at a rental property, what is the value of that property after the mortgage is repaid and capital gains tax paid, for example? So making sure that tax is taken into account. Transfers of property between parties may have tax consequences as well, so it's also worth getting appropriate advice just to make sure that's taken into account. And also, as we've touched on as well, different assets can produce different future incomes or outcomes to the parties. So just making sure the whole property versus investment, the different types of assets are considered fully. Then with regards to pension sharing orders and the point on implementation, unfortunately, it can take quite a while to get those over the line and implemented. So just to manage people's expectations, if you're going through divorce and the pension sharing annex and consent orders have been submitted to court and approved, you get your final order or decree absolute. It can still take up to 4 months for that pension scheme to implement that pension sharing order. And unfortunately, in some cases, even longer. I think we've all seen in the news about the absolute disaster Capita had with civil service pensions recently in taking over administration of that. So I imagine their pension sharing orders are heavily delayed at the moment. So it's just worth noting that, unfortunately, this isn't an income stream that will start immediately on divorce. It can take a while to implement.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, good point, Dan.
Yeah, it's a really good point. Um, Natasha, how do people once they've got all of this information and they've perhaps agreed everything, how do people then go about taking the steps that they need to do to implement what they've agreed?
Yeah, so once the court is in divorce, a court will make an order. Other couples who they're not pension sharing, but they're thinking about just settlement agreement at this stage. They might just think, well, actually, I don't want to get divorced. That's different. They won't be able to look at pension sharing. So that's important to be aware as well. As Dan said, even if you've got pension sharing, it can take some months after before it's implemented. Some couples will say we want to separate, and they may go and see Dan and say we're separating. We want a financial plan for the next 2 or 3 years, which is an interim plan because we don't want to divorce. Some couples might be retired and think we don't want to divorce at all. We don't want a pension sharing. We want to share the pension income for now, and we don't want the certainty of a divorce. So it's not always that they will have an order, but assuming they have got an order, they can implement it themselves or they can have the solicitors implement it for them. But that's pay half the share each, or one person pays a share of the pension sharing order fee. So there will be a charge to the administrator. Not all administrators, but most administrators will charge. All of those things have to happen in order for everything to be finalised. And the final divorce order that comes in, which was once called decree absolute, now called final divorce order, it's the same thing, but the same paper, that all needs to be done to implement the order. So the order becomes, much of those orders become enforceable after the divorce bit is done. So you can't just, as Dan says, think, oh, well, I've reached this agreement now, someone will sort it. And that is a pitfall. I think Dan's right about implementation, and he probably sees it from a financial point of view often before we do, because we'll do the orders, forget about it, if you like, it's all finished and the client has said, look, I don't want you to do that, I'm going to do that myself. They don't instruct us to do it. And then it's often financial advisors or financial planners who will come by this, because people go in and they go, well, hang on, who did that? When was that done? And they say, I didn't know I had to do that, even though you may have said that. They might say, oh, I forgot about it, or I thought it was done just by sending it off and didn't realise I had to do anything with the next letter. So it is really important. Dan, I'm sure you've seen that, haven't you? Trying to implement things that should have been implemented years ago.
That's a really good point, actually. So the 4-month implementation period I mentioned earlier actually only commences once the pension scheme that's being shared has all the information they need to implement that. And it can take sometimes in a lot of cases to try and get all the information required to that pension provider. Unfortunately, pension schemes are often understaffed, I'd say. So you can often take a long time to get answers to very simple questions, particularly for myself, if I was acting on behalf of Mrs. Trying to receive a share of Mr.'s pension, I will contact the pension scheme provider who will say, well, this isn't Mrs.'s pension, so I can't speak to you. So that's a bit of a blocker to getting things moving. But there are ways that we can help clients get that implemented. But yes, it can take a while to get all the ducks in a row before that 4-month period starts.
Yeah, I was just thinking actually while you were talking, there's that sense of relief as well. I think sometimes, or for some people, there's a relief when it's finished and you've got your order, and then that relief can kind of make you forget some of the really, the more dull things that you then have to do afterwards, perhaps. Yeah.
And you might have spent legal costs, and understandably people don't want to, they spent legal costs to get there, or professional fees, other professional fees, and often you think, I just need a break from that now. I don't really want to, but it is really important. You will get this is what you need to do at the end, and those things do need to be followed up.
Yes.
And it's also important to get advice early if you're the person receiving the pension. So that won't be as relevant if it's some pension schemes. You have to accept the share of the pension within the scheme. So Dan will know, so public sector pensions, you might have a teacher's pension or armed forces pension coming to you. In other schemes, Dan will explain this in more detail. I'm sure you can expand on this, Dan, but the pension is shared to you, and the pension provider will ask you where you want that pension to go, your share. So you might be having 50% of the pension, and they may say you can't have it in this scheme, or you have a choice to keep it in this scheme or out of this scheme. I'm really crossing over to what Dan will say in a moment, because he's the financial person. But yeah, that's the point to remember, because that can delay it as well. And then that can be months, because I didn't know that. And then they go off and get financial advice, because you have to go and get some, we don't have to, but you ought to have some input, whether you're speaking to a pension company or speaking to an independent financial planner or advisor. Is that fair, Dan? I don't know what your timescales are like, but I know that I have had clients come back and it's been months, and they say, well, actually my wife still doesn't know what she wants to do with this pension, and my pension company hasn't been able to implement the pension sharing order because of that.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. So with public sector schemes like NHS teachers, internal only is the option when it comes to implementation. So that means the person receiving the pension credit will get their own NHS or teacher's pension. But for private sector defined benefit schemes or defined contribution schemes, generally external is the transfer option, which means you would have to go to a new arrangement. And it can be implemented by the client themselves, or they might look to seek advice. So if it was a client I was advising, I am often instructed before the settlement is concluded. So in that way, we can get everything aligned, the advice given, the paperwork prepared as far as possible. So when the final order is granted, 90% of the work has already been done, so it really speeds up the implementation process.
Yeah, it's another example of why getting that advice early is a really good idea. And it sounds quite complicated as well. The steps that you've got to take. So one step at a time. Make sure that you've got a really clear outline of exactly the steps you need to take, and that you do those in the order that they need to be done.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so Dan,
sorry. I would just say a final point of that is just reminding people, and it's still very, very common for people to say, we've done this ourselves and we didn't think we need a pension sharing order, and we've wrote to our pension company. Dan, you must have seen this, because I've seen it quite a few times, and I know that financial planners talk to me and they've had that, where they say, well, they didn't realise they need a formal order from the court to share the pension. So they write to whomever it is and say, we've agreed that my wife's going to have 50% or my husband's going to have 20% or whatever. And then that delays things, because they didn't appreciate that there isn't a power for them to do that in a traditional type of scheme. I'm not talking about different financial plans might be different, but in a pension scheme as such, they don't appreciate that. I'm sure you've had the same, Dan.
Yeah, absolutely. That's probably a common misconception. Yeah.
Okay, so mistake number 4, Dan, 4 or 5.
Yeah, so mistake number 4, and we've touched on this briefly already, but making decisions based on today's emotions instead of tomorrow's life, effectively. So we've already touched on, obviously, divorce is an emotional time, and financial decisions are needing to be made. So it's appropriate you get the right help with that. And some examples of those decisions would be wanting to keep the family home at any cost, as we've already touched on, accepting a settlement just to bring matters to an end. I see that a lot. And maybe even rejecting sensible proposals because the emotions have understandably taken over. So yeah, a lot of these emotional decisions are very much, I suppose, in your wheelhouse, Claire. So it'd be interesting to hear from you about how you support clients with that emotional decision making.
Yeah, so I mean, all of those things that you've just mentioned are really good examples of where present bias and the present emotion that you feel and present fears that you might have can kind of hijack sort of more rational, logical brain function. So you go into perhaps fight, flight, freeze. And, just I remember my first divorce, I remember for the first few months thinking the very thought of having to move out of my home would sort of put me into a real tailspin and of a kind of a very visceral feeling. And I see clients who feel like that all the time. Several things that you can do. First of all, the power of taking a pause when that happens is huge. So taking a pause, taking some really, really deep breaths and reminding yourself that in this present moment, you're safe. In this present moment, you're okay. And that this is a process to go through. And also, when I'm working with clients who have a very challenging, perhaps ex-partner, one of those ex-partners perhaps who is pressurizing them to accept an initial settlement, there are some lines you could learn. So learn some lines to say, I can't agree to anything right now, I need to take some advice. Or I need to take 5 minutes, or I'm not prepared to discuss this over the dinner table. I want to take this to my solicitor or my financial advisor and get some advice on it. So things to kind of take the heat out of the moment, because what I see happen often is, somebody will say, well, you're always putting pressure on me to do this, that, and the other, and then it escalates. So some kind of things that you can learn to take the heat out of the moment and buy yourself some time at the same time can be really helpful. And then we talked a little bit about guilt, didn't we, as well? Guilt and feeling those very strong feelings, and also the uncertainty. There's uncertainty here, and your brain likes to know where it is. It likes to know what's going to happen, and uncertainty is dangerous in itself to your brain. It feels like a threat. So talking about all of these things, perhaps with a therapist or with a coach like me, will really help you to start to take a step back from those big emotions, perhaps see through the fog, and separate those immediate emotions from the long-term decision making. So when I'm working with clients, I help them to identify the feelings that they're having. We look at what those feelings are trying to tell you. We look at what that feeling is telling you that you need. And then we might talk about motivations. What is it you're frightened of? What is the fear? How can you mitigate that? What advice do you need? And also, what skills do you have? What other skills do you have? What else have you overcome in the past that has given you skills that are going to be useful now? So there's a lot, and it's all very individual depending on the person's outlook and how they are and what's happened to them and so on. But it's all about taking that step back from the very, very strong emotion that you might be feeling right now. And sometimes for some people it might be to say, I just need a little bit more time as well. I need a little bit more time to get my head around what's happening right now. So there's all sorts of different things that I can do to work with people to help them get to the point where they're not making decisions based on today's emotions, but they're thinking actually about tomorrow and what's really important to them and what they would like to be at the center of that life going forward. So
can I ask?
Yeah.
Can I ask about something that comes up fairly often, I think, in my matters, is that when there are adult children involved, sometimes those children, it's more common now, isn't there, particularly in their 20s, to still be at home because they can't afford to rent and be out. I find that in itself can create pressure. So I can think of one recently where my clients accepted much lower than they probably should have done, because of the adult children putting pressure on them, early 20s or mid 20s, some of them at home, some of them not, and how you then deal with that, because the biggest fear in that situation for that client was, I don't want a situation where I may become estranged from them because I'm making a decision which you're telling me is fair, that might then impact on my relationship with my children, who are very aware of the situation. They don't understand it because they're not old enough to understand the ins and outs of finances and marriage, etc. But they do understand that this will potentially put pressure on the person that they're living with, or the other spouse in this situation. Do you have you come across that before, and how do you advise clients to deal with that?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, isn't it? And yes, that sort of thing can happen quite a lot. What I would say is, I mean, I do a lot of exercises with my clients where I get them to stand in their shoes, those children's shoes, their ex's shoes, and think about it from all those different angles. And sometimes you can come up with a way to identify some of the issues, talk to the children, because this is coming from a place of fear, isn't it? It's coming from a place of fear that I will become, like you said, that maybe I'll become estranged from my children. So the important thing to start off with is to identify what it is you're afraid of. And then I will work with clients to help them think about how they could perhaps communicate with the children in perhaps a different way, how they can become much more curious, perhaps, around what the actual fears of the children are, whether they're teens or early 20s or even older sometimes. Every situation is different, but I think the big key here is to get curious about A, your own feelings, and B, their feelings. Because often people are making assumptions about how the other person might feel. They're making assumptions about what the other person, what their motivations are. And if I can help people to have more open conversations, then often that can be really helpful. And also perhaps a family therapist as well might be able to get involved and talk to all of the parties in something like that. I only work with individuals, so I might be talking to the parent in that situation, or I suppose I might be talking to the child in that situation if the child's an adult and they come for some advice. But I think I would often give them a recommendation for a family therapist so that they could go and discuss all those things together as a group and try and come up with solutions or answers to those things. The other thing I think is that often those things we most fear don't happen. And to look at your relationship with those children and really focus on the strength of that relationship and keep feeding into the strength of that relationship, and also keeping the children informed and so on all the time. So there's all sorts of things you can do, I think. Everybody in that scenario is coming from their own place of fear, aren't they? All of those people are coming from their own different emotional spot. And so actually all of them could probably do with talking to somebody to help them work out those feelings and communicate with each other. Does that answer?
Yeah, because it's not always the spouse, it's often the whole family dynamics.
Yeah, and it's not simple either. There isn't a simple I can wave a magic wand and fix everything either. Unfortunately, I wish there was.
No.
I like what you said before, Claire, about, as well as considering other people's feelings, of course, just considering what your feelings would be from your future self's perspective.
Yeah.
Sort of looking back at the past and seeing how you'd feel, just to help you with your today's decisions.
Yes, absolutely. I do a lot of work with that. We look at actually past versions of yourself and future versions of yourself and see what advice they might give to you as well. So yeah, we do that quite a lot too. Because those are, those emotions when they are really hot and they're what's the right word, they are fueling behaviors and actions that can really prolong everything and make it all so much more expensive. So the more we can do to help people be curious and not act on assumptions, and recognize the feelings of the other people around them, the better, really. I think we need to probably move on to mistake number 5.
Sure. So last but not least, and I suppose it nicely ties together everything we've discussed so far, but it's about not getting the right advice early enough. So I think we've all established that we all have our unique ways that we can help clients going through separation and divorce. So it's just the way to address it as a client is not thinking about bringing extra people on board or extra fees, but just think about just getting the right advice from the right people, because clearly I can't give legal or emotional advice, and then vice versa. So you need to have the right people on board to help answer your different questions. So, for example, your solicitor will help you with what's the legal position with regards to this matter. Claire, as a coach, you could help answer how can I cope with this process? Where do we go from here? And then myself, as a financial planner, can help answer questions such as what will this settlement actually mean for the rest of my life? So, for me, I often summarize the future financial planning for clients around 3 main questions, which is where will I live? What will I live on, and what will I retire on? And linking back to cash flow modeling, that's a good way of just helping visualize what the financial impacts on divorce would be.
Yeah, those 3 questions as well really dovetail beautifully with the kind of questions that I'm talking to clients about when we're at sort of this stage of the process, around what's important to me. What are the main things that I want to make sure are in my life? How do I want my home to feel? How do I want my life to feel? All of those things. And so, that at that point, our work really comes together in a really productive way at that stage. Very briefly then, before we finish, we thought it would be really good to end on a, rather than a mistakes note, but a kind of what could you do instead? So I think, Dan, you had some questions that people that people rarely ask, that perhaps could think about asking, that would really help them. So perhaps you'd like to run through some of those, so that people can go away with some really positive steps that they can take and questions they can ask.
Sure. So as part of initial inquiries, it's very common for clients to ask these types of questions, which actually I feel should maybe be reframed slightly, just to help them with their post-divorce financial position. So, for example, instead of asking, can I keep the house? It's really, can you afford to keep the house? If asking, is this a 50-50 split? Maybe ask, will this leave both of us financially secure? And instead of how much is the pension worth, it's certainly worth asking, what income does it provide in retirement? That's often a more important metric. And then lastly, can we agree this today or in the short term? But more ask, have we understood the long-term consequences? So hopefully the reframing of those simple kind of questions will be helpful to people.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. Natasha, is there anything you wanted to add to those?
No, I think that's a great summary and conclusion by Dan in terms of those questions. I really like the simplicity of the questions, earlier, what will I live on, where will I live, and what my pension will look like, and then expanding them on in different ways they're all really, really sensible, and things that we would ask as well as Dan would ask, and probably that you would ask in terms of where they are. The only, I want to say positive, but the only comment I would then say, just a final thing, is try and keep the picture big, looking at the things that you can, because so often we sometimes get caught up in the little things, that who's having the television, and then things that we're emotionally attached to, might be something that someone gave us, or that we felt that we should. I see that so often, and Dan will see it very often. You again get caught up in it. So by looking at these questions in the bigger picture, and that's your starting point, it can hopefully then let you find ways to try and separate out the other issues, which can become bigger than they need to be, really.
Yeah, absolutely. And I suppose that you've really identified another pitfall there, I suppose, haven't you? That oftentimes people can get involved in a dispute about something, that the cost of being in the dispute far outweighs actually the value of the thing that we're talking about. I was talking to a client about this just this morning, actually. So yeah, that might be another one for a whole other webinar.
Proportionality, I think, is one that is a really interesting discussion to have another time, because it's something, Claire, that is much more emotionally driven than lawyers or financial planners can probably understand. I think we see it probably from our perspective in a much more linear way. Excuse me. Whereas I imagine clients, it might be a credit card that was taken out, and forensically thinking, well, this was going through it because this was done without my involvement. But the value of that from our point of view seems, this is it, it's easy to see. And so I think that it's quite, they do take up a lot of time in cases because people do feel emotionally linked to those issues, I think, rather than some things like a pension can feel less emotionally attached, can't it? So it's definitely a discussion for another time, Claire.
Yeah, it is. It's back to that kind of present bias thing, isn't it? So I suppose the question I'd be asking might be something like, what emotion is this? What emotion is this thing evoking in me? What does it mean to me? And then going from there and digging into that. So without going off on a major tangent about that, I think, the big message, I think, from today is that, divorce is absolutely one of the biggest financial events that people will ever experience, along with one of the most traumatic emotional events that they can ever experience. And, it's very clear from what Dan's talking about, the decisions that are made now can affect you for a very long time to come, for years, where you live, how much income you have, how comfortably you can retire, perhaps. So, taking the time to really get a really good understanding of the long-term financial implications of any settlement that might be in front of you is so important. And I don't know, Dan, if there's anything else you want to add to that as a kind of final thing to say.
Sure. So yeah, I'd probably just close with just making sure that you take the time to understand those long-term financial consequences before you agree to a settlement, because it can clearly make a significant difference to your financial future.
Yeah, thank you very much. And Dan, before you go, could you let everybody know how can people find you? Where are you, and how can they get in touch with you? And I'll make sure these details go onto the YouTube and the Spotify as well, so that people can find you if they would like to.
Yeah, thank you. So probably the best way to get in touch with me is through the Centurion Chartered Financial Planners website. So if you go on there, you'll find my my bio page with my mobile number, email address. Very happy to have free initial consultations with clients just to see if there's a way that I might be able to assist them through the divorce process. So please feel free to get in touch.
Thank you. We'll make sure that we put a link to Dan's page on the Centurion website so that people can get in touch with you. Thank you very much, Dan. That's been super helpful, and I hope that everybody watching has taken away some really, really helpful, useful action points from that. And also, Natasha, thank you very much as well for all the legal input today.
Thank you both.
Hopefully that's been a really, really interesting and useful session for everyone. So thank you very much. And Dan, I'm sure we'll see you again in the not too distant future.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Thank you both.
Thank you.